Part 1: Broken Home, Burning Soul, a novelized story of Johnny Depp's early life, Owensboro, Kentucky, 1963. The rain was steady the morning John Christopher Depp II was born, a soft southern downpour that drummed against the windowpanes like a lullaby or a warning, depending on who you asked. Inside the small hospital room, Betty Sue Palmer lay exhausted, her gaze locked on the newborn in her arms. She didn't cry, not yet. The nurses cooed and wrapped the boy in a thin blue blanket, whispering congratulations with the hollow familiarity of those who witnessed too many beginnings and too few endings. His father, John Sr., stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the rain instead of his son. They would name him Johnny. Not John like his father, not really. And though he would carry the same blood, the same eyes, the same dark hair, this boy was already a storm of a different kind. Miramar, Florida, 1974. The house on Southwest 132nd Avenue was plain, like most of the houses in that blistering stretch of southern suburbia. Sun-bleached stucco, weeds pushing up through cracked pavement, heat rippling off the rooftops like mirages. Inside, the Depp household was less like a home and more like a battlefield with dinner tables and crucifixes. Johnny was 10. Small for his age. Sharp-eyed. Quiet, except when he wasn't. He'd learned early how to read the room, how to track the shifting moods in his mother's voice, how to recognize the slamming of a cupboard as a warning sign. Betty Sue was fierce, proud, and bruised by life. She could be kind, but she could also break you in half with a look, or with whatever object was closest to her hand. His father? Quiet in a different way. Withdrawn. The kind of silence that wrapped around you like a fog. Johnny sometimes wondered if his dad loved him, or if he was just too tired to show it. One night, Johnny lay curled in bed as the shouting started, muffled at first, then rising in pitch. He could hear the usual words. "You think you're better than me!" And then the crash of glass. The walls in their house were thin. The memories would be thick. Later, Johnny crept into the living room. Betty Sue was smoking, eyes red, face unreadable. His father sat slumped on the couch, staring at the floor. The silence that followed was worse than the fight. It was that night Johnny made a promise to himself, though he didn't have the words for it yet. "I will get out." The guitar he found it in the attic. An old Harmony acoustic guitar with rusted strings and a broken neck. It belonged to his older brother Danny once. Now it belonged to Johnny. At first, he just plucked it like a curious bird tapping glass. But something awakened in him, not a talent, not yet, but a hunger. Danny showed him chords. E minor. G, a painful, clumsy F. Johnny's fingers bled, his wrist ached, but he didn't stop. Not when his mom shouted at him to turn it down. Not when his father left for good one summer afternoon without saying goodbye. Music was the one thing Johnny could control. When he played, the world stopped hurting. 1979. By 16, Johnny had already lived through things most kids couldn't name. He smoked too much, drank too early, had an attitude that swung between cocky and completely broken. School was a prison cell with fluorescent lighting. So he left. Just walked out one day and never came back. His mom was furious. Danny nodded quietly. His older sister, Debbie, said he was crazy. But Johnny knew one thing: there was no life for him inside a classroom. He joined a local band called The Flame, which became The Kids, which became everything he believed in. They rehearsed in garages, played dive bars, opened for bigger bands. Johnny slept on floors, in vans, in other people's apartments. He didn't care. The music roared inside him like a fever. Like freedom. Rachel, she was wild-eyed and wore her eyeliner like war paint. Johnny met her after a gig in Miami. She danced like she didn't know the world was watching. Rachel was the first girl who made him believe he was worth something. They made love like fire and screamed like children. She told him he was going to be a star. He told her she made the world tolerable. But it didn't last. Rachel left him for a drummer with a record deal and a better car. Johnny didn't cry. He went home, smashed a chair against the wall, and wrote 3 songs in one night. It would be the first of many heartbreaks that turned into sound, Los Angeles, 1983. They loaded their gear into a beat-up van and drove west. No money. No plan. Just a dream that smelled like gasoline and motel sheets. Hollywood wasn't what they expected. Dirtier. More desperate. Johnny worked odd jobs, telemarketing, pumping gas, whatever paid for guitar strings and food. Lori, a makeup artist he met through friends, was kind. Older. Grounded. She took a liking to Johnny. They got married in a cheap ceremony no one attended. It wasn't about love, not really. But she saw something in him. Something raw. Something casting a long shadow. One night, she handed him a phone number. This guy is casting a horror movie. They need someone who looks interesting. Johnny rolled his eyes. He wasn't an actor. He was a musician. Always had been. But something inside him, that same burning soul that hated rules and school and fists through drywall, whispered, why the hell not? Part 2, From Strings to Screen, The Reluctant Birth of an Actor, Los Angeles, 1983. The apartment smelled like old vinyl, stale coffee, and ambition. The furniture was secondhand, the fridge was usually empty, and the walls were thin enough that Johnny could hear the couple next door argue about everything: money, cigarettes, love. He could relate to all three. By day, he made cold calls selling ink pens over the phone. His voice was smooth enough to get people to listen, but his heart wasn't in it. He wasn't selling anything except the illusion of stability. At night, he rehearsed with the kids in a rented storage space lit by flickering bulbs and beer-soaked dreams. But the music scene in LA was unforgiving. The glitter of Sunset Strip masked a rot, everyone chasing the same impossible spotlight. It wasn't like Miami. There were big fish in a small pond. Here, there were plankton floating through a sea of neon sharks. He was barely 20. Already broke. Already wondering if it had all been a mistake. Lori's favor. Lori and Allison was more than a makeup artist. She was sharp, connected, and maybe the only person who genuinely believed Johnny was destined for something greater. Even after their shotgun marriage began to quietly unravel, she still looked out for him. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of rejections and ramen noodles, she handed him a slip of paper with a phone number. Call this guy. Wes Craven. He's casting a horror movie. Low budget. Weird stuff. But it could be something. Johnny laughed. I'm not an actor. Lori didn't blink. So? You've been acting broke, desperate, and charming for years. Might as well get paid for it. He dialed the number, expecting nothing. But the next thing he knew, he was standing in front of a casting director, reading lines with a blank stare and a slow voice that somehow passed for intensity. A few days later, they called. You got it. Got what? The role. A teenager. Gets eaten by a bed. Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. He didn't understand the script. Who the hell was Freddy Krueger? What kind of monster killed people in their dreams? But Johnny showed up. On time. Learned his lines. Let the special effects team pour gallons of fake blood all over him as he was swallowed into a mattress. He didn't complain, even when it took hours to clean off the red goo. The movie came out. It was a cult hit almost instantly. Teenagers screamed. Theaters filled. Critics smirked. And suddenly people started asking, who's that kid? But Johnny didn't feel like a star. He didn't even feel like himself. It all felt like someone else's life. Someone with straighter teeth and clearer purpose. Nicolas Cage. They met through a mutual friend at a dive bar in the valley. Nicolas was already buzzing with early fame, eccentric, intense, and strangely kind. He liked Johnny immediately. They talked about Bukowski, guitars, and how bullshit the industry was. Cage asked him, what do you really want to do? Johnny didn't hesitate. Music. You can do both, Cage said. You're a mystery. Hollywood eats that up. Johnny laughed. I'm not trying to be famous. Nicholas leaned in, serious now. It's not about being famous. It's about getting in the door. After that, you decide which rooms to walk into. That stuck. 21 Jump Street, 1987. He auditioned reluctantly. A cop show about undercover high school agents? It sounded like a joke. But he needed the money. And the producers needed someone with cheekbones and eyes that looked like they held secrets. He got the role, Officer Tom Hansen. A sensitive rebel with a badge and a soul. Teenagers across America fell in love with him overnight. Posters. Fan mail. Screaming girls outside his apartment. Johnny Depp, teen idol. It made him sick. He hated the scripts. Hated the bubblegum dialogue. Hated being told to smile. The producers tried to mold him into a marketable heartthrob. But he wasn't plastic. He was sharp edges and strange thoughts. He smoked too much, read too much Kerouac, and refused to play nice. After 2 seasons, he begged to be let go. Threatened to ruin the show if they didn't write him out. Eventually, they gave in. Hollywood was stunned. Who walks away from fame? Johnny did. Tim Burton. They met over coffee at a cluttered office in Burbank. Tim was pale, awkward, and wore his hair like a lightning storm. He barely made eye contact. He said, "I've seen your stuff. I think you're weird." "That's good." He was working on a script called Edward Scissorhands. A story about an artificial man with blades for fingers and a heart full of sadness. "I don't want someone handsome," Tim said. "I want someone haunted." Johnny read the script that night, alone in his dim apartment, chain-smoking and underlining sentences like they were gospel. He felt something he hadn't felt since he first picked up a guitar. Connection. Edward wasn't a character. He was Johnny. A boy made by someone else's vision. Beautiful, broken, and longing to be understood. The role that changed everything. He buried himself in Edward. Shaved his soul down to raw nerve endings. The costume was tight and the makeup took hours, but Johnny didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't acting. He was being. When the movie premiered, it wasn't just a success. It was art. Critics praised his sensitivity. Directors called him fearless. Studios saw a strange new leading man, not the clean-cut all-American, but the outsider. Johnny Depp had found his tribe, the weird, the wounded, the wonderful. He was no longer the pretty boy from TV. He was an actor. Part 3. Teen Idol, Rebel Soul, A Love That Burned Bright, and the Price of Being Different, Los Angeles, 1990. Johnny sat in the corner of the Chateau Marmont courtyard, sunglasses on, cigarette burning between his fingers, half listening to a producer pitch him another slick studio project. He nodded politely, but his mind drifted, back to the set of Edward Scissorhands, back to Tim Burton's quiet, strange world where he finally felt like someone understood him. Fame had returned, and this time it came with critics' praise, magazine covers, and agents whispering words like Oscar potential and leading man. But Johnny was wary. He didn't want fame. He wanted truth, messy, flawed, artistic truth. But Hollywood didn't deal in truth. It sold illusions. So Johnny did the only thing that made sense to him. He became unpredictable. Winona. He saw her across a crowded room at the premiere of Great Balls of Fire. Porcelain skin, black hair, dark eyes that looked like they'd seen things most people couldn't name. Winona Ryder. She was already a rising star. Beetlejuice, Heathers, Lucas. But there was something behind her eyes that mirrored the quiet hurt in his. When they finally spoke, it was like the world blurred around them. "I feel like I've known you in another life," she said. "I think I've been looking for you in this one." He answered. It was teenage poetry, but they meant every word. Their love burned fast, furious, and beautiful. She moved in. He stopped sleeping with the TV on. They drank cheap wine, watched old films, made each other mixtapes, and talked about ghosts. He got a tattoo. Winona forever. For a while, it felt like nothing could touch them. Choosing the strange, the industry expected him to ride the Edward Scissorhands wave straight into blockbuster territory. Instead, Johnny did the opposite. He chose roles that confused executives and excited artists. A half-dead undercover cop in Donnie Brasco. A drug-addled journalist in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. A cross-dressing director in Ed Wood. People didn't understand. Studios grumbled. But directors loved him. He gave everything. Disappeared into characters. Bled for the screen. When asked why he kept choosing such strange roles, Johnny shrugged. Normal bores the hell out of me. But inside, it wasn't just about being interesting. It was about control. He had grown up with chaos, fists, slammed doors, silence. Playing outsiders gave him power over his pain. It gave him language. The tabloid tornado Johnny and Winona were Hollywood's gothic royalty, beautiful, mysterious, and deeply in love. The press followed them everywhere. Every gesture was photographed, every argument exaggerated, every smile dissected. They tried to stay normal. But it's hard to be normal when strangers scream your name at 2 a.m. or camp outside your window with cameras. Johnny started drinking more. The music that once calmed him now blasted at full volume, trying to drown out the static. Winona felt it too. They loved each other, but the pressure was corrosive. In 1993, they split. He didn't speak to anyone for a week. He stared at the tattoo on his arm, Winona Forever, and had it altered to Wino Forever. It was a joke. A scar. A reminder. River. They were kindred spirits, Johnny and River Phoenix. Both childlike, both sensitive, both carrying wounds the world couldn't see. Johnny had opened a nightclub, the Viper Room. It was supposed to be a creative space, a place for musicians and misfits to breathe. But on Halloween night, 1993, River collapsed on the sidewalk outside. Speedball overdose. 23 years old, Johnny was there. He saw it happen. Tried to help. Watched the ambulance drive away. River didn't make it. The media crucified the club, the scene, the entire culture. Johnny was devastated. He stopped playing music for a while. Drank more. Slept less. He said later. It was one of the darkest nights of my life. He still saw River in dreams. Isolation fame had become a prison, one with velvet ropes and glass walls. Everyone wanted a piece of Johnny Depp, but few wanted Johnny. He turned down roles that would have made him a household name, Neo in The Matrix, less that in Interview with the Vampire. He didn't want the spotlight, just the art. He bought a ranch in the desert. Spent time with Hunter S. Thompson, one of the few people who made him laugh. They shot guns, drank bourbon, and talked about the absurdity of it all. Hunter said, "You're not an actor. You're a fucking character who escaped the book." Johnny grinned. "Aren't we all?" Part 4: Strange Love and Stranger Roles, The Unraveling of Romance, and the Rise of a Cinematic Enigma. New York City, 1994. The lobby of the Mercer Hotel smelled of polished wood and French cigarettes. Johnny leaned back in a leather chair, boots on the table, waiting for her. The chaos outside, paparazzi, fans shouting, stayed muted behind the thick glass. Then came the click of heels. Kate Moss walked in like a secret, pale skin, stormy eyes, a body like smoke. At 20, she was already a global icon, the face of Calvin Klein and the symbol of heroin-chic fashion. But beyond the headlines, she was brittle, brilliant, and haunted, a perfect match for Johnny. They didn't speak much that night. Didn't need to. The electricity between them was volcanic. A love like fire. Their relationship was all extremes. Luxury suites trashed in a haze of passion and rage, nights that bled into days with no sleep, champagne for breakfast, whispers in bed, broken glass on the floor. They fought, made up, fought again. There were smashed hotel rooms, screaming matches behind velvet curtains, and photographers hiding in the bushes. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. To them, it was love, Johnny once said. She was the only person who could level me without saying a word. But their love burned too hot. And eventually it burned out. Dead Man, 1995. In the middle of this romantic inferno, Johnny made one of his strangest choices yet, a slow, black and white western about death and identity, directed by the philosophical Jim Jarmusch. In Dead Man, he played William Blake, an accountant turned fugitive who wanders a surreal American landscape with a Native American guide named Nobody. The role was strange, dreamlike, introspective. Johnny barely spoke. His eyes did all the acting. Critics were split. Audiences confused. But Johnny didn't care. He said, "That film taught me that silence can scream louder than words." Fear and Loathing, 1998. Johnny had become close friends with gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson, a friendship forged over wild nights, whiskey-soaked conversations, and mutual distrust of the mainstream. When the film adaptation of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas finally moved forward, there was no question Johnny would play Royal Duke. To prepare, he moved into Hunter's basement, studied his voice, his movements, his madness. He wore his clothes, smoked his cigarettes, lived his life. The result? A performance so immersive it made audiences dizzy. Critics called it chaotic. Some said it was a masterpiece. Others said it was unwatchable. Johnny said, "I didn't act that role. I survived it." Kate crashing as Johnny's roles grew stranger. His real life began to fracture. He and Kate were no longer just lovers. They were addicts. Addicted to each other, to the chaos, to the rush of being untouchable and undone. In 1998, in a suite at the Mark Hotel in Manhattan, Johnny was arrested after allegedly trashing the room during a fight with Kate. Furniture was shattered. The damage was extensive. But he was calm when the police arrived. He blamed a rogue armadillo. Kate sat on the edge of the bed, silent, mascara streaking her cheeks. They lasted a little longer. But not much. He loved her. Still does, in some quiet corner of his soul. But love isn't always enough. The Ninth Gate, 1999, another departure. Another plunge into shadow. Roman Polanski's The Ninth Gate cast Johnny as Dean Corso, a rare book dealer caught in a labyrinth of satanic lore and European darkness. The film was eerie, elegant, and laced with ambiguity. Johnny played it like a ghost wearing a suit, smooth, cynical, detached. He wasn't acting like a man unraveling. He was one. The press noticed his weight loss, his erratic answers in interviews, his unwillingness to play the fame game, but the performances kept getting better. Johnny wasn't chasing awards. He was chasing something else, something darker, something truer. The quiet between the storms. By the end of the decade, Johnny Depp had become the patron saint of the beautiful weird. He wasn't Brad Pitt. He wasn't Tom Cruise. He didn't want to be. He was the guy who chose poetry over popcorn, mystery over fame, and sadness over simplicity. But something was shifting in Hollywood. A new era was coming, and so was a role that would change everything again, not just his career, but the way the world saw him. The sea was calling. A pirate, a compass, a curse, and the return of an unexpected legend. Part 5: The Island of Peace, A Pirate's Fortune, and the Search for Stillness in a Storm. The Caribbean, early 2000s. The waves lapped gently against the sand, turquoise folding into gold, the sky endless and patient. Johnny stood barefoot on the shore of his private island in the Bahamas, 45 acres of untouched paradise, hidden from cameras, reporters, and noise. He had named it Little Hall's Pond Cay. Here, there were no scripts, no agents, no flashing bulbs. Just silence, wind, and the occasional splash of sea turtles drifting by. It was peace. Real, rare, earned. But peace, for Johnny Depp, had always come at a price. Jack Sparrow Rises in 2003, Disney took a gamble on an unusual script based on a theme park ride, Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl. It was meant to be a family adventure film. Safe. Predictable. Broad. Until Johnny walked in with gold teeth, smeared eyeliner, dreadlocked hair, and a swagger inspired partly by Keith Richards, partly by Pepe Le Pew, and entirely by instinct. Executives panicked. What is he doing? Is he drunk? Is he gay? Is he ruining the movie? But director Gore Verbinski trusted him. Producer Jerry Bruckheimer backed him. And Johnny never flinched. He said, "Jack is not just a pirate. He's a survivor. A trickster. A man who's been through the fire and came out laughing." Audiences agreed. Pirates of the Caribbean exploded. It became one of the biggest box office surprises in decades. Jack Sparrow was a global phenomenon, a new icon in the pantheon of cinema. Kids loved him. Adults were fascinated by him. Studios, once skeptical, now begged for sequels. And Johnny, he finally had the power to make any film he wanted. But power never made him comfortable. Buying freedom, he bought the island the same year Pirates premiered, not to celebrate, but to escape. It was his antidote to fame.no's cell signal. No red carpets. Just solar-powered cabins named after the people he loved: Hunter, Vanessa, Lily Rose, Jack, Marlon, and Gonzo. Johnny swam every morning, played guitar at night, fished, cooked, read. He brought friends and artists, kept the place sacred. Here, he didn't have to perform. Here, he could just be. Vanessa Paradis, the French singer and actress, entered his life like a whisper, soft, strong, and unafraid of his shadows. He met her in Paris in 1998, but it wasn't until years later that she became his anchor. A voice of reason. A quiet force. They never married, never needed to. What they had was deeper. She gave him 2 children, Lily Rose Melody and Jack John Christopher III, and with them, a reason to evolve. Johnny said, "Until my kids, I never truly understood love. They broke me open." With Vanessa, he found domestic calm. The kind of partnership that didn't need fireworks to feel profound. She understood his silences, didn't ask him to be anyone but himself. They split time between France, LA, and the island, keeping their lives as private as possible. For nearly 14 years, they built a quiet, beautiful world. But nothing stays untouched forever. More pirates, more pressure as the Pirates franchise exploded, with sequels in 2006, 2007, and 2011. Johnny became a brand. Jack Sparrow was no longer just a role. He was a business: deals, merchandising, theme park revamps. Millions became billions, and slowly, the machinery of Hollywood began pulling again. Johnny, ever the rebel, tried to subvert it. He made odd, dark choices in between blockbusters: Finding Neverland, where he played J.M. Barrie with soft ache; The Libertine, a drunken, decaying poet; Public Enemies, as John Dillinger, America's Most Wanted. But the public wanted Jack. Studios wanted Jack. And with every sequel, the weight of expectation grew. The cracks beneath the calm. Even as the island offered refuge, Johnny couldn't outrun the storms inside. His lifelong struggles with anxiety, insomnia, and addiction resurfaced under the pressure. He drank more, stayed up for days on end, vanished into guitars, into silence, into roles that let him escape. The fame he never wanted had returned tenfold, and though he still visited the island often, he could feel it, the stillness beginning to crack. Vanessa noticed. She loved him, but she saw the darkness gaining ground. They began drifting. Slowly. Silently. Like 2 ships no longer sailing the same wind. The calm before the hurricane. By 2012, Johnny was the highest paid actor in the world. He had love, family, a private island, but inside, he was unraveling, again. The peace he found on Little Hall's Pond Cay had given him balance, but it hadn't healed the deeper wounds. Something was coming. A shift. A fall. A woman with red lips and a gaze that held both danger and desire. Her name was Amber Heard, and she would turn his life upside down. Part 6. Cracks in the Mirror, Love Turned Venom, and the World Watching a Man Fall Apart. Los Angeles, 2012. The first time Johnny saw Amber Heard, she was gliding across the set of The Rum Diary, sun-kissed, fearless, sharp as glass. She was everything Hollywood loved: young, beautiful, rising. To Johnny, she was something else entirely. A spark. A dare. A mirror. He had just quietly parted ways with Vanessa after nearly 14 years. There were no scandals, no tabloid-fueled feuds, just the slow, quiet ache of 2 people growing apart. Amber was the opposite of quiet. She was fire, and Johnny, ever drawn to the flame, followed. The pull of chaos. Their relationship began in secret. He was 49, she was 26. The age gap raised eyebrows, but Johnny had always walked outside the lines. Friends noticed the change. He laughed more, acted younger, showed up in public with a new kind of confidence. For a time, it seemed like he had rediscovered passion. But passion is a double-edged sword. Amber challenged him, charmed him, tore into his silences with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Their fights were volcanic. The makeup sex, cinematic. The cycle, addictive. She moved into his world fast, into his houses, into his press appearances, into his life, and slowly into his storm. Behind the doors, Johnny had always lived with ghosts, childhood trauma, depression, the shadows of fame. He had found ways to cope: music, art, characters more real to him than his reflection. But Amber's love wasn't soft. It was conditional. It was fierce, jealous, unrelenting. Their arguments escalated. Plates thrown. Words sharpened like knives. Doors slammed. Accusations hurled. And through it all, Johnny did what he had always done. He retreated inward. He drank more. Escaped into touring with the Hollywood vampires. Disappeared into his own silence. In public, they smiled. On red carpets, they dazzled. But behind closed doors, the mirror was cracking. The wedding and the beginning of the end. They married in 2015, on his private island in the Bahamas, a tropical ceremony cloaked in luxury and secrets. Friends attended. Champagne flowed. Vows were exchanged. Smiles were staged. But some of his closest confidants later said, "We knew it wouldn't last." It didn't. Months later, the fights worsened. Johnny was constantly away, filming, playing music. Amber accused. Johnny withdrew. They clashed like waves against jagged stone. Then came May 2016. Amber filed for divorce. Days later, she filed a restraining order, arriving in court with a bruised face and shaking hands. She said he had been violent. She said she feared for her life. The world froze. Trial by media. The fallout was immediate. Headlines screamed. Studios panicked. Activists rallied. Social media exploded into war zones of hashtags and half-truths. Johnny Depp, beloved outsider, Captain Jack, artist, icon, was now painted as a monster. Disney quietly dropped him from future Pirates films. Warner Brothers grew distant. Endorsement deals evaporated. He released a statement denying the abuse. Friends and family came forward. Former partners, Winona Ryder, Vanessa Paradis, defended him, saying he had never been violent. But in the court of public opinion, the damage was done. For the first time in decades, Johnny was no longer just misunderstood, he was vilified. Alone again, he returned to the island. Drank. Stared at the sea. He had lost his marriage. His public image. His roles. Even his children were pulled into the chaos. Forced to read lies about their father in every tabloid and scroll past cruelty online. Johnny wrote music instead of giving interviews. Poured his anger and grief into lyrics, into chords, into art. He filed a defamation lawsuit. He wasn't just fighting for his name. He was fighting for the truth. The cracks widened from 2018 to 2020. The world watched Johnny battle in courtrooms across the globe, first in the UK, then in the US. The UK libel case against the Sun newspaper, which called him a wife-beater, became a circus. Amber testified. So did Johnny. The judge ruled against him. More headlines. More backlash. Then came the American defamation suit against Amber herself, a $50 million lawsuit centered around an op-ed she wrote in the Washington Post, painting herself as a victim of domestic abuse. She didn't name him. But the implication was clear. Johnny responded not with fury, but with evidence, audio tapes, witness statements, timelines. And for the first time, the narrative began to shift. Reflection in the broken glass in interviews. Johnny never begged for sympathy. He said only, "I've been through darkness. But I know who I am. And I know the truth always rises." He was thinner now. Older. Tired. But not defeated. There was still fire in his eyes. Still defiance in his art. Still love in how he spoke about his children, his craft, his solitude. The mirror had shattered. But in the shards he began to see something else. A man who had survived hell, not for the applause, but for his soul. And the world, finally, was starting to listen again. Part 7, Public Enemy. When silence becomes scandal and a man is condemned before he can speak. London, 2018. The air was gray. Cold. Damp with the kind of fog that seeped into the bones, and maybe into the soul. Johnny Depp stood outside the Royal Courts of Justice in a long, dark coat, his eyes hidden behind tinted lenses. Cameras flashed like lightning. Questions were shouted. But he didn't answer. He was here not for art, not for film, not for music. He was here because he was suing a British tabloid that had called him two words he could not ignore: wife beater. The lawsuit wasn't just about a headline. It was about a legacy, a reputation, a life's work being rewritten by accusation and insinuation, and the cost, win or lose, would be staggering. The Sun and the firestorm in April 2018. The Sun, one of the UK's most widely read and scandal-thirsty tabloids, published an article that eviscerated Johnny. The headline condemned Warner Brothers for keeping him in the Fantastic Beasts franchise. The subtext was clear. Why are you still hiring a man who abuses women? It wasn't just speculation, it was a public execution. Johnny denied the allegations. Repeatedly. Forcefully. In letters. In court filings. Through representatives. But the tidal wave had already formed. Hollywood turns away. The impact was immediate and unforgiving. Studios stopped calling. Deals dissolved. Media outlets, once eager to court him, left him out of feature spreads and red carpet highlights. A generation that once idolized Captain Jack Sparrow began to call for his erasure. Petitions trended. Journalists turned cold. Former allies went quiet. Even Disney, the house that had once built a billion-dollar franchise around his charisma, began whispering about moving in a new direction. He was still a box office draw. Still a cultural icon. But now, he was toxic. The studio's silence at Warner Brothers, executives were split. Some still backed him. Some wanted him gone. In 2020, just days after losing the libel case against The Sun, a decision that rocked his camp and heart alike, he received a call from the studio. Polite. Final. Please resign from Fantastic Beasts. He did, without protest. Without press conference. Just a short letter to fans, thanking them for their support, and promising the truth would prevail. But in private, the blow was brutal. He had lost more than a role. He had lost the right to be seen as innocent until proven guilty. The libel trial, a circus of pain. The trial in London was grotesque, not just in content, but in its transformation into public theater. Amber took the stand. So did Johnny. Private text messages were aired. Audio recordings played. Accusations of drug abuse, rage, violence, infidelity, cruelty, all laid bare. Johnny, for his part, never flinched. He admitted his vices. His temper. His emotional pain. He denied violence. Repeatedly. He wept quietly in court, a man being dissected under the brightest lights. The judge ruled against him. Not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because the standard for libel in the UK favors the press. The ruling stung like betrayal. It emboldened his enemies. The backlash and the blacklist after the verdict, media outlets declared it the end of his career. Think pieces bloomed like weeds. Johnny Depp, the fall of a legend. From heartthrob to headline. Cancel culture's most famous victim or villain? He didn't respond publicly. Instead, he turned to what had always saved him: solitude, music, the canvas. He played guitar with Jeff Beck. Painted haunting portraits in blood red and black. He toured in Europe where crowds still cheered, still remembered, still loved. But the damage in America was deeper. He was now a man without a studio. Without a franchise. Without a platform. Just a shadow. Fatherhood in the fire through it all. Johnny's children remained his anchor. Lily Rose was stepping into her own spotlight, modeling, acting, navigating fame on her own terms. Jack, more private, stayed close to home. They never spoke against him. Never fed the machine. But he knew the headlines hurt them. He saw it in Lily's eyes. In Jack's silence. And it broke him. Not because he feared their love, but because they were seeing the world treat him as something he wasn't. And that was the cruelest punishment of all. A quiet rebellion. In early 2021, he sat for a rare interview with the Sunday Times. He spoke softly. Clearly. The truth is all that matters to me. I've lost nothing that can't be rebuilt. But what's been done to me, to others, in this climate of judgment before facts, that should scare everyone. It wasn't an angry quote. It was a warning. He was beginning to rise again, not with fire, but with stone. Slowly, quietly, foreshadowing the fire behind the scenes, his legal team had already launched something seismic: a $50 million defamation lawsuit against Amber Heard for her Washington Post op-ed. She hadn't named him, but everyone knew who she meant. And this time, the trial would be in the United States. This time, it would be televised. And this time, Johnny would not be silent. Part 8: Trial by Fire. The world watches. The man fights. And the truth is set alight. Fairfax County, Virginia, spring 2022. The courthouse looked ordinary from the outside: red brick, beige walls, government signage. But inside, it was anything but. This was no typical legal proceeding. This was Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard, the $50 million defamation trial turned global spectacle. Every morning, Johnny arrived with a smile, dressed like an outlaw dandy, tailored suits, ponytail neat, silver rings gleaming. His fans gathered in droves, cheering, weeping, holding handmade signs like religious talismans. Amber walked in with colder poise. Stoic. Controlled. And between them, 7 jurors, hundreds of cameras, and the wreckage of a love story turned war zone. Taking the stand, Johnny stepped into the witness box like a man preparing for execution. The world had already tried him once. Now, he stood to speak for himself. His voice was low, measured, vulnerable. He spoke of childhood trauma, of his mother's cruelty, of becoming a father and trying, desperately, to be nothing like the man who had raised him. He detailed his career, his passions, his flaws, and then he spoke of Amber, how she charmed him, how the relationship shifted, how love became surveillance, how every word became ammunition, how fights escalated into slaps, bottles thrown, fingers severed. He never once called her evil. He called her sick, hurt, lost. But he denied, with unwavering calm, ever laying a hand on her in violence. No matter what happens, I came here to speak the truth. That's all I have left. The tapes in the sterile air of the courtroom, the jury heard recordings. Amber's voice, mocking, dismissive. Tell the world, Johnny, tell them, I, Johnny Depp, am a victim of domestic violence, and see if people believe you. It was a dagger in real time. The internet exploded. For years, Johnny had been branded an abuser. Now, people were hearing a different story, one tangled, painful, but not one-sided. Support swelled. Hashtags trended. Memes bloomed. Critics debated ethics while late-night hosts made jokes. It was justice as entertainment, cruel, bizarre, riveting. But beneath it all, a man was bleeding in public. Amber's turn. Amber took the stand with tears in her eyes. Her testimony was graphic, raw, accusatory. She described scenes of alleged violence, sexual assault, drunken rages, fear. Her voice cracked. Her lawyers objected. Her photos were shown. Some in the courtroom cried. Some didn't believe her. Social media became a war zone. Hashtag justice for Johnny versus hashtag believe women. Activists fought. Algorithms fed the chaos. But in the courtroom, the truth had no likes or retweets. Only evidence. And it began to tilt. The Finger Incident, Australia. 2015. A rented house. A fight that ended with Johnny's fingertips sliced off. Amber said he smashed a phone in rage. Johnny said she threw a bottle. Photos. Texts. Medical records. Bodyguards testified. A house manager described cleaning blood off walls. In the end, even Amber's witnesses crumbled under cross-examination. Inconsistencies. Timing gaps. Shaky memories. The defense tried to reframe Johnny's drug use as violence. But addiction, though damning, isn't abuse. And the jury, and the world, seemed to know the difference. The world watches as the weeks dragged on. Johnny became more than a man. He was a symbol of redemption, of resistance, of the broken system of justice for men who don't fit the hero mold. But he never declared victory. Never gloated. Each day, he sat with the same grace, sketching in notebooks, smiling at fans, exchanging quiet nods with his lawyers. He wasn't perfect. He didn't pretend to be. But he was real, and that was enough. Verdict day, June 1st, 2022. The air was thick. The jury returned. Yes. Amber defamed Johnny Depp. Maliciously. Repeatedly. Damages: $10 million in compensatory, $5 million in punitive, later reduced due to Virginia law. Amber was also awarded $2 million in her counterclaim, a nod to the complexity of pain. But the public knew this was Johnny's win. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted. People wept, danced, released signs into the sky like prayers. Johnny wasn't there. He was in England, playing guitar on stage with Jeff Beck, because the music, always the music, never abandoned him. Aftermath: he released a quiet statement. From the very beginning, the goal of bringing this case was to reveal the truth, regardless of the outcome. I feel at peace knowing I have finally accomplished that. Amber fled the spotlight, issuing her own response, defiant but worn. Hollywood, once silent, began calling again. But Johnny wasn't racing back. He went home to the island. To his children. To the silence. Because peace was finally real, and this time, he had earned it. Part 9. Reclaiming the Flame. When the storm passes, a man must choose what to build from the ashes. Summer 2022, Europe. The gavel had fallen. The jury had spoken. The crowd had roared. But Johnny Depp didn't celebrate like a man who had won a prize. He exhaled like a man who had been saved from drowning. And then, he disappeared. Not to a movie set. Not to a mansion. To a stage. To a guitar. To Europe. Touring with Beck. Within days of the verdict, Johnny was on the road with Jeff Beck, the British guitar legend. Not for press. Not for spectacle. For soul. Every night, he walked on stage to thunderous applause. Leather, scarves, eyeliner, the old armor. But his playing was quiet rebellion. Blues. Rock. Covers of Dylan, Lennon's Isolation, and his own moody, haunted tracks. It wasn't acting. It wasn't performance. It was healing. I've had the worst years of my life, he told Beck. But this reminds me who I am. Fans traveled continents just to hear him bend notes. To see him smile again. He wasn't pretending anymore. He was reclaiming. The Cannes Resurrection, May 2023. The Palais de Festivals. A new film opened. The Cannes Film Festival. Jean du Barry, a French-language historical drama. In it, Johnny played King Louis XV, his first major role after the trial. The screening received a 7-minute standing ovation. He bowed with wet eyes. He wasn't just acting in another film. He was standing on sacred ground, as a man once told he'd never belong again. Critics debated. Some called it redemption, others revision. But none could ignore the truth. Johnny Depp was back. Painting the truth during his silence. Johnny had painted, not walls. Not for decoration. Portraits. Of heroes. Friends. Icons. Keith Richards. Bob Dylan. Elizabeth Taylor. River Phoenix. Al Pacino. Faces of defiance. Of brilliance. Of pain. In mid-2022, he released a collection titled Friends and Heroes. It sold out in hours. Not because of his name, but because of what the art said. Each brushstroke told a story. He wasn't just reviving his career. He was reclaiming his voice in every medium that had once saved him. On the island far from the noise, Johnny returned often to his private island in the Bahamas. Here, he swam in still waters, played acoustic riffs to the ocean, drank coffee as the sun rose over peace instead of pressure. He invited close friends, not celebrities, but musicians, painters, artisans. People who didn't want anything from him. Sometimes he wrote. Sometimes he just stared at the sky. And no more handlers. No more Hollywood meetings. No more walking on eggshells for image. He didn't need the machine anymore. He had survived it. On Amber, he didn't speak of her again. Not publicly. The lawsuits were settled. The op-ed withdrawn. Amber left for Europe, stepping out of the spotlight. He harbored no gloating. No hatred. Only distance. The pain was now a scar, not a wound, and he wore it like he wore his rings, heavy, yes. But his. For the kids, his children, had watched the war, and the resurrection. Lily Rose had starred in HBO's The Idol. Jack remained elusive, artistic, protected. To them, He was never Jack Sparrow or the Mad Hatter or Louis XV. He was Dad. And that mattered more than anything a studio could offer. A new code. In an interview months later, he was asked if he felt vindicated. He lit a cigarette, smiled. "I don't know if you ever really win, but I know when you stop running." He talked of trust, of rebuilding, of learning what silence costs, and what speaking up demands. He wasn't chasing blockbusters. He wanted to create, to collaborate, to surprise. His fire hadn't gone out. He had simply learned how to protect it. Legacy rewritten. Johnny's story was no longer one of rise and fall. It was about endurance, not a comeback. A return, not for applause, but for truth. And truth, as he'd learned in Blood and Headlines, is the most radical form of art. Part 10. The Man Behind the Curtain. Beyond the roles, the riches, the rumors, what remains is the man. Autumn 2024. Somewhere quiet. There was no red carpet. No paparazzi. No screaming crowd. Just a breeze through trees, the low hum of a record spinning an old blues track, and the faint clink of ice in a glass. Johnny Depp sat alone on a worn leather chair, paint on his fingers, a guitar resting nearby, and silence in his chest that didn't ache anymore. He had stopped performing for the world a long time ago. Now, he only performed for the truth. The curtain falls, slowly. He had played pirates and poets, monsters and madmen. He had walked through fire and fame, scandal, and silence. But there comes a time when every man must step out from behind the curtain of what others see, and ask himself who he really is without the lights. Johnny had always been a chameleon, slipping between skins with alarming ease. But now, stripped of the need to be anyone else, he faced the hardest role of all, Johnny. Just Johnny. A legacy measured in scars. His films still aired. His music still played. His face still graced posters, magazine covers, gallery walls. But his greatest creation wasn't a character. It was the endurance of the man beneath them all. He had been betrayed, branded, buried. Not once, but over decades. Yet every time the world tried to end his story, he rewrote the next page with ink made of ash and defiance. Fame had given him a voice. Pain had given him something worth saying. And art had saved him, again and again. Letters unsent in a dusty drawer, he kept letters he never mailed. 1 to his mother, equal parts rage and forgiveness. 1 to River Phoenix, frozen in grief. Untouched for years. 1 to Amber, short, unsparing, but not cruel. And 1, written in shaky hand. To his children. If the world ever tells you who I was, ask them what they were afraid of, and then decide for yourself who your father is. His circle now: no managers with clipboards, no lawyers drafting statements, just old friends who called before sunrise to talk about guitars, brushstrokes, or bad coffee. He collaborated only when it felt right. He painted what he dreamed. He recorded what he couldn't say. He never returned to the machine. Hollywood had become a story he once lived, not a place he needed to revisit. The island on his island in the Bahamas, sun still set the same way it did when he first bought it, low, gold, and tender. He had once described it as the only place that makes sense. Now, it was his cathedral, his confession booth, his quiet revolution. He walked barefoot, swam at dawn, talked to the wind like an old friend. Sometimes he wept without knowing why, other times he laughed louder than the waves. But always he was there. Fully. Finally. Final Frames. In late 2024, a documentary quietly premiered at an independent festival. The Man Behind the Curtain. Directed by a longtime friend, it wasn't flashy. No reenactments. No PR polish. Just Johnny in his own words. Cigarette smoke curling upward as he spoke of life, art, love, pain, and the strange, violent grace of being human in public. It was raw, honest, uneven, beautiful. Critics were stunned. Audiences wept. It wasn't a redemption arc. It was a reckoning, and in its final scene, he looked into the camera, not as Jack, or Edward, or the Mad Hatter, just Johnny. All I ever wanted was to tell the truth without being punished for it. Fade to black. Epilogue. He didn't die on screen. He didn't vanish in scandal. He didn't chase the myth. He just lived, every day a painting. every night a riff. Every breath a choice to remain soft in a world that tried to harden him. He became what few ever managed to be, not a hero, not a victim, just real.